A young woman was found dead on the floor of her own apartment. The police began an investigation and immediately uncovered several very alarming facts. It turned out that the residents of this complex had long noticed something strange and lived in fear. During the investigation, detectives learned more and more horrifying details until they finally arrived at an unexpected truth. But it was only the beginning. Stephanie Bennett was born on August 30th, 1979, in the small American town of Rocky Mount, Virginia. When she was little, her parents divorced and Stephanie stayed with her mother. However, their father lived near their home and the young woman continued to see him almost every day. Later, her father remarried and Stephanie gained a stepsister named Diana. After school, Stephanie enrolled in Roanoke College located 350 kilometers from her home. In her final year, she met a guy named Walter and they soon started dating. After college, the couple moved to different cities but they continued to be together. Stephanie moved to the city of Raleigh, North Carolina with her stepsister, Diana, and their mutual friend, Emily. The three of them rented an apartment in the Bridgeport residential complex, located in a quiet, peaceful area on the outskirts of the city. The young woman found a job at IBM while her boyfriend moved to Greenville, South Carolina to obtain an engineering degree. Stephanie lived in Raleigh for about a year. By that time, she and her sister and friend were planning to move to different cities. The young woman, who was only 23 at the time, was planning to move to Greenville to be with her boyfriend, and the couple had already begun looking for a place to rent. In May, Stephanie went to Greenville where she and Walter looked at several apartments and chose a suitable option for rent. When she returned to Raleigh, her friends and sister were no longer in the apartment. Emily had moved to another city and Diana had gone away for a few days to attend a funeral. On the evening of May 20th, Stephanie came home from work and spoke to Walter on the phone. Her boyfriend was planning to send her a rental agreement via fax for her to sign. They agreed that he would send it the next day when she could use her work computer. The following day, Walter tried to reach her, but Stephanie didn't answer either her work or home phone. He then called her sister Diana, who contacted Stephanie's colleagues. It turned out that Stephanie didn't show up to work that day, which was very unusual. Stephanie was always responsible and would have informed her boss if she was sick. Moreover, if she was at home sick, she would have answered the phone. Diana asked her friend to go to their apartment and check if everything was okay. There was no answer when they knocked on the door. Then Diana asked the apartment manager to open the door with a spare key. As soon as the man entered the apartment, he saw a horrifying sight. Stephanie was lying lifeless on the floor of the room with no clothes on and bruises on her neck. The manager immediately called the police. Detectives found Stephanie's documents and confirmed that the deceased was indeed her through a photo. On the laundry basket cover, which was under the window in Emily's bedroom, investigators noticed leaves and concluded that the killer may have entered the apartment through the window. They also discovered that the home phone was in the closet in Emily's room and the cable was cut. Apparently, the perpetrator was hiding there and took the phone with him so Stephanie couldn't use it. After speaking with Diana, the police determined that several items were missing from the apartment. The perpetrator took $8 from Stephanie's wallet, 2 tape recorders, and the laundry basket from Stephanie's room. It seemed that he had put the stolen items inside the basket. Experts found semen on the victim's body and extracted a DNA sample, but it wasn't in the FBI database. They also determined that the cause of death was strangulation. Interestingly, the perpetrator took the object he used to kill a victim with, as the police were unable to find it in the apartment. Meanwhile, investigators interviewed all the residents of the complex, hoping someone might have seen the killer. During these conversations, the police learned that something strange had been happening in the residential complex for several months. People regularly noticed someone peeping at them through the windows of their apartments. They complained to the manager, but the management of the complex could not find the person. Interestingly, at least once this person was seen at Stephanie's window. In addition, several months ago an unknown man near the lake near the complex assaulted a young woman who went for a run. After this incident, Stephanie was afraid to stay alone in this apartment and wanted to move to Greenville as soon as possible. Detectives studied the area around the complex and discovered something strange. In the bushes they found dozens of pieces of women's underwear, which, as later turned out, belonged to Stephanie. The police thought the killer took them out of the apartment, but then, for some reason, threw them in the bushes. However, soon this version was refuted. It turned out that a teenager living in the neighboring apartment regularly sneaked into Stephanie's room and stole her underwear, after which he threw it into the bushes. He admitted this when investigators questioned all the residents, but he denied his involvement in the murder. His DNA sample was taken and it did not match the sample obtained from the killer's semen. For this reason, he was no longer suspected of the crime. The police believe that the most obvious candidate for the role of the killer was the same man who repeatedly peeped at the female residents of the complex through the windows. After talking to everyone who had ever noticed this person, the detectives compiled an approximate portrait. It was published in newspapers, but it did not yield any results. As part of the standard procedure, investigators checked the victim's boyfriend. He voluntarily gave his DNA, which did not match the killer's sample. In addition, at the time of the murder, Walter was hundreds of kilometers away from her home and physically could not have been there. After that, the police went to all the male residents of the complex, asking them to voluntarily give their DNA. This also did not yield any results. The experts did not find a single match among the 283 samples obtained. At this point, they did not have any serious leads. Detectives organized surveillance of the residential complex, hoping to catch the man who was spying on the residents. To their surprise, they quickly succeeded. On June 3rd, the police noticed a man who approached several windows on the ground floor and peered into the apartments. Stopping at one of the windows, this person began to satisfy himself and the police immediately arrested him. This pervert turned out to be Christopher Lee Campin, who had been caught spying several times before and had been convicted of stalking a woman 3 years earlier. The detectives thought they had finally caught the killer, but they were disappointed. Christopher's DNA did not match the sample found on the victim's body. He was charged with spying, but they stopped considering him a suspect in the murder case. Since then, the police continued to work on the case, but they had no substantial leads. A year later, the lead detective heard about a lab in Florida that could determine a person's ethnicity based on their DNA. However, he had doubts about this technology, but he didn't want to miss such an opportunity. As a test, he sent the DNA of 4 of his colleagues of different ethnicities to the lab. The experts succeeded in their task, 100%, and the detective sent them the DNA of Stephanie's killer. The lab determined that the DNA belonged to a white person, but this information did not help the police much. The victim's father offered a reward of $100,000 for any information that would lead to the capture of the killer. Her mother wrote a letter which was published in local newspapers, begging people to share with the police any information that could help identify the suspect. All of this brought some new leads, but they did not lead anywhere. In April 2004, based on the testimony of multiple witnesses, detectives decided to interview all residents of the complex again. They suspected that the man arrested for voyeurism might not have been the only one who walked around the complex buildings and peeked into other people's windows. Knowing the identity of the first man and having his photographs, the investigators wanted to talk to the residents who had seen the voyeur again. Unfortunately, none of them had ever seen his face. Most often, this man appeared at night, and he almost always wore a hood. However, some witnesses said they saw him without the hood, but could only see that he had long hair. Detectives interviewed several dozen people until they finally reached a man who saw this person right in front of Stephanie's window before her murder. His testimony was already with the police, but this time he remembered something else. The witness claimed that he saw this person a few days after the incident, during daylight hours. This man was walking his dog near the wooded area behind the residential complex, and the witness recognized him by his hoodie. He watched him for a while until he disappeared behind the trees with his Labrador. Apparently, the witness simply forgot about this incident or did not think it was related to the murder. So during the initial questioning, the police did not receive this information. One thing is for sure. Detectives only obtained this information 2 years after Stephanie's death. Now they knew they should be looking for a man with a Labrador. Judging by the fact that this person was walking his dog in the area, he must have lived nearby. And here the detectives noted one interesting fact. Behind the forested area where the witness saw the man, there was another residential complex. He could well have lived there. The police went there and asked the staff if there was a man with a Labrador among the complex residents. They immediately gave them the name of 35-year-old Drew Planton, as well as added a few interesting details. All the complex employees considered him somewhat strange. He hardly talked to anyone, never looked people in the eye, and was generally very unsociable. The man was very thin with long hair and always wore baggy clothes. Many people thought he was trying to attract as little attention as possible. In his case, however, it worked just the opposite. The police decided to find out more about this person and talked to an elderly resident who, according to the staff, kept an eye on everything happening in the complex. And here, they were in for a very unexpected turn. When they told her they were investigating the murder of Stephanie Bennett, the woman replied, "Everyone knows it was that guy with the big dog." The detectives were, to say the least, shocked. It took them 2 years to get to this person, and the residents of his complex initially suspected this man. But none of them deemed it necessary to share their suspicions with the police. It turned out that Drew had moved out of that complex and settled on the other side of town. The investigators decided to talk to him and came to his apartment. But no one responded to their knock on the door. They came there several more times at different times of the day and never received an answer. Either the man was never home or he intentionally did not open the door for them. While they tried to locate Drew, the police questioned his former neighbors at his old place of residence. They managed to find several witnesses who shared troubling facts. A woman living on the floor above had seen Drew in the company of a young boy a few days after Stephanie's murder. They were walking down the street and talking about something. According to the witness, Drew asked the boy to stop contacting the police and not to tell them anything. The investigators immediately concluded that the young man in question was the same teenager who had stolen underwear from the victim's apartment. Having spotted him during the runs or walks in secluded areas, the man would either closely observe them or even follow them. Detectives who had been unable to speak with Drew found his place of work and headed there. He was a chemist at a fertilizer production laboratory, and the investigators managed to catch him at his workplace. He immediately stated that he had not heard of Stephanie Bennett's murder, which was strange considering that he lived just a kilometer away from her complex at the time. The man clearly had no desire to talk to the police and told them he was very busy at the moment. Drew told the investigators that they could come to his home at an appointed time and he would answer all their questions. The detectives met him at his apartment and the man finally opened the door to them. During the conversation, he stated that he had never walked his dog near Stephanie's. However, given that the police had many witnesses who had repeatedly seen him in that area, the investigators immediately understood that he was lying. The man also claimed that he did not wear glasses, even though his driver's license indicated that he was required to wear them while driving, and several witnesses had reported that the man who was peeping into the windows of other apartments wore glasses. As expected, Drew refused to voluntarily provide a DNA sample. The detectives then decided to conduct surveillance on him, hoping to obtain a sample in a different way. However, this proved to be a very difficult task since the man did not leave behind any items that could be sent to the laboratory. For example, during lunch breaks, he would leave work, sit in his car, and just stare at one point. The man did not eat anything, so the investigators could not obtain any objects with his DNA. Once they noticed Drew throwing an empty water bottle into a garbage bin. Detectives took it and sent it to the laboratory, but experts were unable to extract a DNA sample from it. According to one version, Drew took someone else's bottle and purposely threw it on the street, knowing that he was being watched. After that, the police decided to obtain his garbage, but here too they were unsuccessful. For several days, they never saw Drew take it out. Interestingly, the man's neighbors also could not remember ever seeing him with a trash bag. Next, investigators asked Drew's boss for help. The woman agreed to help them obtain any item from his workplace that might contain Drew's DNA. She watched him for several days, but was unable to get a hold of any item. Drew rarely ate at work, never threw anything away, and she couldn't find a single hair on his desk, which seemed strange given that the man had fairly long hair. Investigators were already convinced that Drew was intentionally covering up all traces to prevent them from obtaining his DNA. One day, the boss saw him tying his hair back with a rubber band and then bending down to pick up all the hairs that fell in the process. After that, the woman decided to invite him for a lunch break at a cafe to supposedly discuss some work matters. But even there, the man was extremely cautious. He mostly ate with his hands, put all the used napkins in his pocket, and even took the straw and cup with his drink. For dessert, they ordered banana pudding, and Drew finally used a fork, but then wiped it with a damp napkin for 15 minutes, ruling out any possibility of obtaining a DNA sample from the utensil. Despite this, the investigators still took the fork and sent it to the laboratory. The experts were able to find tiny traces of DNA, which showed a partial match with the DNA of Stephanie's killer. However, the result was too imprecise, as more biological material was needed for a full comparison. In the end, the detectives obtained a warrant to search Drew's workplace. They hoped to find some item containing his DNA. The investigators were afraid that the man might escape if he found out about the search, so they decided to conduct it in the evening. Among the suspect's belongings, they found gloves that he had to wear when working with chemicals. The detectives understood that his DNA might be inside, so they took them and left another pair in their place. They still feared that Drew might try to run, so they kept him under surveillance for several days until the laboratory confirmed. The gloves did, in fact, contain his DNA. On October 18, 2005, police quietly surrounded the laboratory where a man worked and waited for him to come out. Investigators feared that if they tried to arrest him inside the building, he might take one of his colleagues hostage or attack them. Their concerns were not unfounded. When the man emerged from the building, he was immediately apprehended. He was found to have a loaded pistol on him, and apparently knew that the police were just steps away from catching him and had no plans to surrender easily. During a 6-hour interrogation, the man, Drew, remained silent and refused food, water, and hardly moved. Eventually, detectives had to put him in a wheelchair to move him around the area. After obtaining a search warrant for his apartment, investigators found a laundry basket stolen from Stephanie's home, 2 rifles, 40 knives, a sword, and a machete. Among his belongings, detectives also found a set of lock picks and handcuffs. They found a notebook with dozens of women's names and immediately located them to ensure they were safe. One of the women was the same resident of his complex who had complained about Jude during the investigation. She said that he had been watching her on the street and she felt uncomfortable with his gaze. Her concerns were confirmed when police found her underwear and tampons in Drew's home, as well as a copy of her high school graduation tape. It turned out that Drew had broken into her apartment, taken the tape, made a copy, and returned the original. All this time, he kept these items even after moving. In his apartment, they also found a check in the name of a woman who was killed in 1999. Investigators learned that at the time, Drew lived in her city and moreover, the woman was shot with a fairly rare caliber gun. But exactly such a weapon was found in the man's collection during the search. Thus, Drew became a suspect in this case. But first he had to stand trial for the murder of Stephanie. A month after his arrest, the prosecution officially announced that they would seek the death penalty. The trial was supposed to begin the following year, and Drew spent that time in solitary confinement. But the trial never happened. On January 1, 2006, a man was found dead in the same cell. Despite all precautions taken, he managed to end his life. Investigators had no doubt that Drew had killed Stephanie Bennett. But after a search of his house, the inevitable question arose. How many other victims could this person have had? At the very least, he was highly likely to have been responsible for the woman's murder in 1999. But detectives were practically certain that Drew could have been involved in other crimes. After carefully studying his biography, the police discovered several interesting facts. Drew grew up in a complete family with 3 brothers. Their father constantly humiliated and beat the children until the mother fled with them to another state. As a result, Drew became a very withdrawn teenager, and this only intensified in the future. Despite this, he received a good education and got a decent job as a chemist. His colleagues said he was very smart, but his social skills were practically non-existent. He had no friends, he didn't talk to anyone at work, and always tried to keep as far away from the team as possible. Interestingly, Drew's own brother also had a criminal record. He peeped at women with a hidden camera and received a suspended sentence. In 2008, Drew's mother sued the state government, accusing the authorities of causing her son's death. However, the judge concluded that the prison staff had taken all prescribed precautions and could not stop the man. Stephanie Bennett's father tried to sue the management of the residential complex for ignoring residents' reports of a peeping Tom and not paying enough attention to the safety of residents on the premises. In his opinion, there was not enough lighting around the building at night, and anyone could walk there unnoticed. He also learned that the window in his daughter's apartment had been broken, but the complex management did not rush to fix this problem, even though it was their direct responsibility. But in the end, the man himself refused these accusations, not commenting on his decision. Thus, this complex and confusing case was ultimately solved. Police to this day wonder how many other victims could Drew have had. The available information indicates that the man was prone to serial crimes, but after his death it became practically impossible to find out the truth. Share your opinion in the comments. An 18-year-old Alaskan young woman disappeared from the coffee shop where she worked. Strange messages began pouring in from her phone, but the police and FBI couldn't find a single lead. Through an extensive investigation, they did manage to uncover the truth, but all of them couldn't imagine that they were dealing with one of the most gruesome crimes in history. 1993 in Anchorage, Alaska. The state's largest population center is characterized by a quiet, measured lifestyle, a harsh climate, and vast expanses surrounded by snow-capped mountains. The girl loved animals very much, so after school she planned to find a job related to them. Another option for her was a career as a doctor. Samantha even considered applying to the Navy as a nurse. In her spare time, Samantha was a nurse. She was a nurse who worked in the Navy. She worked part-time at a Subway restaurant and a Harley-Davidson dealership. In early 2012, when she was 18, she found another part-time job at a small chain coffee shop downtown. Samantha was excited about the opportunity. First of all, the job was easy enough. Secondly, she had to be alone on her shift, so the whole work process depended solely on her. Her boyfriend, however, did not share this enthusiasm. He was worried about Samantha having to work through the night alone and tried to talk her out of it. But eventually, he supported her decision on the condition that he would pick her up after each shift. She assured him that the coffee shop was full of cameras and even had a panic button to call the police. Even though the coffee shop was in the middle of nowhere, it was a fairly deserted area, like most of Anchorage. The city has low population density, so even in the downtown area, you can see empty streets. Also, the daylight hours are short in winter in Alaska, so Samantha had to work a lot during the hours of darkness. Samantha fell in love with the job and quickly got the hang of it. By early February, she had already worked there for a month, and on the first of the month, she was getting ready to finish her shift at 8 p.m. as usual. A customer came out 5 minutes before the coffee shop closed and ordered a large Americano. Samantha prepared the drink and turned to the window to give it to the customer. He took the glass and immediately pointed a gun at the young woman. An unidentified man in a ski mask stated that he was going to rob her and demanded that the lights in the coffee shop be turned off. Samantha complied and the offender immediately broke in through the window. His surveillance camera caught the whole thing, but those silent witnesses could not help her. She also did not press the panic button. Once inside the coffee shop, the perpetrator tied Samantha up and asked where her car was parked. The young woman replied that she didn't have one and added that her boyfriend would be here any minute to pick her up. The man then took her outside and headed for his car. While he was looking around, Samantha managed to break free and ran, but the perpetrator quickly caught up with her and grabbed her. There was not a soul on the street at the time, so no one could help her. The man said that if she tried to run away again, he would kill her. He then led the young woman across the street to his pickup truck and put her in the passenger seat. The perpetrator had obviously prepared in advance since the license plates had been taken off the car. As he drove her to an unknown destination, the man stated that he only wanted a ransom from her family and that Samantha could then go home. He still did not show her his face, which was concealed by a ski mask. All along the way, the young woman tried to convince him to let her go and told him that her family didn't have much money, but the kidnapper wouldn't listen. At one point he asked Samantha where her phone was. The young woman replied that she had left it in a coffee shop, and this enraged the perpetrator. He needed the phone for his ransom plan. So he went back to the coffee shop to get the smartphone and sent 2 messages from it to Samantha's boss and to her boyfriend. In them, the kidnapper wrote on the young woman's behalf that she was tired and would go out of town with friends for a few days. All the while, Samantha was in his pickup truck. After texting, the kidnapper removed the battery from the phone and got behind the wheel again. He drove the young woman to an undisclosed location that looked like a barn and told her to sit quietly. The man stated that if she tried to scream, he would kill her. He also added that he had a police scanner and if she somehow managed to call for help, he would know right away. The perpetrator demanded Samantha's credit card, but things were not so simple here. The young woman said she shared a bank account with her boyfriend and the card was in his possession. So the man decided to steal it. Having first learned the boyfriend's address and PIN number, he left the tied-up Samantha and went to get the card. The young woman told him it was always in the guy's car. Once there, the perpetrator saw the right car and started breaking it open. At that very moment, the guy spotted it from the window and rushed outside, but he was too late. The kidnapper took out the card and quickly fled. On the way back, he stopped at an ATM to check the PIN number, then returned to Samantha's house. Meanwhile, the young woman's relatives and boyfriend were in a panic. The guy didn't believe for a second that the message was written to her and everyone understood that something bad had happened to Samantha. But at that moment, none of them connected the theft of the credit card with the disappearance of the young woman. The guy didn't even think the events could be connected in any way. By nightfall, Samantha's family contacted the police and they began a search. Of course, the first thing they did was to look through the camera footage in the coffee shop and immediately witnessed her abduction. Soon the FBI got involved, but they could not find any serious leads. The perpetrator had clearly prepared carefully for the kidnapping. Not a single detail that could be used to identify him was caught on camera. Meanwhile, the young woman's relatives, with the help of concerned people, raised the $41,000 they had promised for information on Samantha's whereabouts. The parents were constantly being interviewed by local TV stations, begging for any information about their daughter's fate. Flyers with Samantha's picture and information about the reward appeared all over Anchorage, but the police never received a single valuable witness. As the days passed, detectives desperate for answers began checking everyone Samantha knew, including her boyfriend and relatives, but they quickly determined that none of them had anything to do with the kidnapping. Nearly a month passed. On February 24th, Samantha's boyfriend received a new message from her number saying, "Connor, park sign, under Albert's picture. Isn't she cute?" Investigators immediately realized it was about the local Connor's dog park and along with the young woman's relatives headed there. After a while, they saw what the kidnapper meant. There was a booth in the park with various flyers among which was a photo of a dead dog named Albert. The owners placed this flyer on the stand to say goodbye to their pet, but the detectives noticed a plastic bag underneath it. When they opened it, they saw a Polaroid photo of Samantha in the background with a newspaper from February 13th and a letter written on a typewriter in which the kidnapper demanded that $30,000 be deposited in her bank account. He promised to kill the young woman if these conditions were not met. The police and the FBI immediately devised a plan that could help them catch this thoughtful criminal. They told the young woman's father to top up the card in installments so that the kidnapper would have to repeatedly go to the ATMs. He did just that. First, the man deposited $5,000, and a few hours later, that money was withdrawn from one of the Anchorage ATMs. The kidnapper was caught on camera, but even here, the detectives were unsuccessful. The man was wearing a hat, a hood, glasses, and what appeared to be a false beard and mustache. It was impossible to identify him from the photograph. The police immediately arrived at the ATM, but the perpetrator had already fled. A week later, the thief withdrew another batch of money in Willcox, Arizona, the opposite end of the United States. He traveled 6,000 miles to throw off investigators, but they continued to monitor his activities. The next cash withdrawal occurred in Lordsburg, New Mexico, just an hour away from Arizona. Following that, he made 2 more withdrawals in different cities in Texas. In the meantime, police carefully examined ATM photos. They soon realized that the criminal had made a huge mistake in Willcox. He had left his car in the camera's line of sight, so the detectives now knew the model of his car. Of course, it was impossible to make out the license plates in such a picture, but now they had something to work with. Investigators feared the kidnapper might cross the border into Mexico, so all patrols were instructed to stop white Ford Focuses. A few days later, on March 13th, a Texas highway patrol spotted a vehicle of that make in a hotel parking lot. There was a man sitting behind the wheel. The officer decided to wait for him to pull up and follow him. Soon the man drove out of the parking lot and along the highway. As soon as the driver exceeded the allowable speed limit of 3 miles, the patrolman ordered him to pull over at the curb. This was done to put the suspect's vigilance to sleep. If a dangerous criminal is behind the wheel, he may be armed and ready to fight back to the last man, so the patrolman pretended that the reason for the stop was a minor infraction. The driver of the white Ford turned out to be 34-year-old Israel Keys of Anchorage. The policeman was immediately alerted and decided to search his car, calling for backup in the process. Samantha's cell phone and her boyfriend's bank card were found in the car. They also found a gun, a false mustache, a beard, and dark glasses. Police had no doubt that he was behind Samantha's kidnapping, but they were still shocked because Keys had never come to their attention. The man had a perfectly clean criminal history. He lived with his girlfriend and 10-year-old daughter and ran his small construction business successfully. He was respected and trusted among his acquaintances. Even some members of the Anchorage prosecutor's office used his repair and construction services. But one question preoccupied everyone. Where was Samantha Koenig? Under questioning, Keys was extremely calm. He joked and laughed a lot. The FBI agents kept up the dialogue in his style, and after a while, he confessed what he had done. Keys stated that he had been planning to rob this coffee shop for several days. He did not know in advance if he would kidnap the employee. Moreover, he had worked out 2 rules, which he himself broke. Never look for victims near his own home, and never transport them in his car. All of this made him hesitant as he stood in front of Samantha in a dark coffee shop. But he made the decision to act to the end. On the night of the kidnapping, he drove her to the shed in the backyard of his house, where his daughter and girlfriend were at the time. The perpetrator turned on the radio in case his victim tried to scream and left to get the bank card. When he returned, Israel quietly entered the house, trying not to wake his family, poured himself a glass of wine and went into the barn. There, he abused Samantha and killed her. But what about this photo they found in the park? It had the February 13th issue of the newspaper from 2 weeks after the kidnapping, and Samantha appeared to be alive. But in fact, she had been dead all along and there is no manipulation in the photo. Keys fixed her eyelids so that her eyes were open and applied makeup to her face. According to a detective who attended the interrogation, Israel recounted the details of the murder with such ease as if he were listing the foods he'd eaten for breakfast. The perpetrator agreed to tell it all on the condition that the confession portion of the interrogation not be published. He did not want his daughter to hear it all. In doing so, he killed Samantha only a few dozen yards from her bedroom. The detectives already thought Key's story was nearing its end, but that was only the beginning. The morning after the murder, Israel and his family went on a sea cruise from the city of New Orleans. Tickets for it had been purchased in advance, and the perpetrator was well aware that he was committing this murder just hours before departure. Accordingly, he had to leave the body somewhere so that no one would discover it. Keys did the simple thing and left it in the same barn. It was freezing outside, so the body quickly froze. When Keys returned home 2 weeks later, he took a picture with a newspaper and used a typewriter to write a ransom letter. He then separated the body into pieces and went to a small lake 40 minutes outside Anchorage. Using a chainsaw, he made holes in the ice where he placed bags of the body parts and additional weights. After all that, the maniac went winter fishing. It took police divers 10 hours to retrieve those bags from the bottom. Detectives also learned that during his trips between ATMs across the states, Keys used a rental car, the same white Ford Focus. At one point, he had a malfunction and went to one of the dealerships to have the car changed. Surprisingly, that woman played a key role in catching the culprit. The car was caught on an ATM camera before the breakdown, and all the police were looking for that particular model. The dealership gave him the same white Focus, because they had no other suitable cars at the time. Had the situation been different, he would never have been stopped. In the end, during questioning, Keys confirmed what the investigators had already guessed. Samantha was not his first victim. The perpetrator had promised to tell them about all the crimes he had committed in exchange for 2 conditions. First, he wanted a guaranteed death sentence and demanded that it be carried out within a year of being pronounced. He asked that everything he said be kept secret from the press. These conditions surprised the detectives, but they saw no reason to refuse, and the maniac began to tell them horror stories. Israel began committing crimes at an early age. He would break into other people's houses, steal, set fires in the woods, and torture animals. His parents were deep believers, but they practiced a very questionable and unpopular branch of Christianity. Because of his parents' constantly shifting religious preferences, they regularly moved around the country. At the age of 20, Keyes joined the army, where he spent 3 years. A few months before that, he had molested a random young woman after spotting her in an Oregon park. When questioned, Israel said he wanted to get out of the army as soon as possible so he could start killing. After quitting at age 23, he began his killing streak. He's made weapons caches in the woods so he could go there at any time and start looking for victims. Police found 2 such caches in Anchorage and New York. Inside were money, knives, gun, and body disposal supplies. Over the next few years, he regularly went out hunting in different states, but the exact number of his victims is still unknown. The FBI has only been able to pinpoint 5 of them, but detectives believe Keyes committed at least 11 murders, and these are just the cases where many factors point to his involvement. In total, the number of murders could be as many as 30. In addition, Israel had been robbing banks, stores, and private homes so that he always had enough money to buy weapons and travel. In his hiding places, discovered after interrogations, he was found to have considerable cash reserves. Despite all this, the man has never come to the attention of the police except on one occasion. In all interrogations, he denied his involvement, but detectives did not believe him. On March 3, 1996, a 12-year-old girl named Julie Harris disappeared. Israel Keyes, who was 16 at the time, lived in the same neighborhood. Police suspected him after a witness found Julie near Keyes shortly before her disappearance. That the girl's remains were found in the river and her killer was never caught. During interrogations after Samantha's murder, Keyes denied his involvement, but investigators were again reluctant to take his word for it. They did not, however, have any direct evidence. In a conversation with FBI agents, Israel admitted that he had studied serial killers since he was a child. His idol was Ted Bundy, and the maniac wanted to be like him. He felt no remorse for his victims and happily recounted how he managed to lead 2 completely different lives. On the one hand, he was a decent family man and businessman, and on the other, he was an inhuman killer. The only thing that gave any hint of feeling was that Keyes had asked the detectives to keep the details of his crimes from his daughter. He also stated that he had never killed children or anyone who had, again because of his own daughter. The FBI agents did not believe this, but they could not prove otherwise. They were all forced to admit that Israel was an extremely thoughtful maniac who had made only one mistake in his entire series of crimes. The investigators hoped that he would tell them all of his atrocities himself, but that never happened. 9 months after his arrest, Keyes took his own life in his cell. Even though FBI agents had spent hundreds of hours interrogating him up to that point, much he had withheld from them. 11 drawings depicting skulls were found under the bed in his cell. It is possible that each one symbolized a victim. The picture of these drawings were not published until 2020. Thus, Israel Keyes can be considered one of the most violent and elaborate maniacs. He managed to maintain an impeccable reputation, committing dozens of different crimes. Always he might never have been caught. Investigators had no doubt that if he had, he would have continued to kill. Keyes himself said he saw killing as his purpose in life and planned to continue hunting people until he was caught. An 18-year-old young woman drove her car to another city and disappeared without a trace, and a week later her body was found in a river. The police had no suspects, and her car could not be found for years. Only 14 years later did the young woman's relatives learn the gruesome truth. Lisa Kimmel was born July 18, 1969, in the small American town of Covington, Tennessee. Soon her parents had 2 more daughters, and in 1972, the family moved to a town called Billings. From an early age, the girl was distinguished by her independence and determination. She helped her parents take care of their younger sisters and also worked part-time at a local restaurant. Thanks to this, she earned a new Honda CRX for herself, even before she graduated from high school. The young woman also finished her license plate with the inscription, "Little Miss," as she was often called by her parents and sisters, and these plates would play a significant role in the whole story. After graduating from high school in 1987, Lisa decided to continue working at the restaurant, despite her parents' objections. They wanted their daughter to go to college, but the young woman planned to pursue a career in her chosen direction. They eventually agreed that Lisa would work for a year and still consider going to college. The young woman worked at a large chain restaurant, Arby's, along with her mother who was the regional manager there. And soon after graduation, Lisa was offered a management position herself, but already in another city. She was to go to the suburbs of Denver, about 900 kilometers from home, and manage a restaurant there. For the 18-year-old young woman who had just graduated from high school, it was a serious challenge, but Lisa accepted without a shadow of a doubt. In addition, her mother frequently traveled to Denver for work and they saw each other almost every week. Sometimes the young woman herself drove to her family's house in Billings. The restaurant where Lisa worked was in a town called Aurora. She quickly settled into her new place, rented an apartment, and was generally excited about her new life. She made new friends and a few months later started dating a guy named Ed. He often went to Aurora but lived 800 miles away. On Friday, March 25, 1988, Lisa was getting ready with anticipation for the weekend she had big plans for. She was going to go to Billings and take her boyfriend with her to finally introduce him to her family. He lived in Cody, Wyoming, which was along her route. Lisa planned to pick him up and drive on with him from there. She left Aurora at about 4 p.m. She had about 7 hours to drive to the boyfriend's house. After driving about 400 kilometers, Lisa reached Douglas, Wyoming. Apparently, she was in a big hurry, because at 9 p.m. a police officer stopped her car for speeding. According to his radar readings, Lisa was going about 140 kilometers per hour. He gave her a $120 fine, which state law required her to give to the officer on the spot. Lisa didn't have that amount with her, so the police officer suggested she withdraw the money from the nearest ATM near the road. They got there, but the terminal did not support Lisa's bank card. According to the rules, the police officer had to detain the offender, who was unable to pay the fine. But the man agreed to let Lisa go on the condition that she send the check to the local police department. The young woman got into her car and drove on. It was about a 4-hour drive from Douglas to her boyfriend's house. He never waited for her that night and toward morning and fell asleep. When he woke up at about 7 a.m., Lisa was still gone. In those days, there were no cell phones, so he had no way to contact her. Instead, the guy started calling the police departments of the two states. He gave them information about Lisa and her car, wondering if anything had happened. The police accepted the information, but would not file a missing persons case. The reason for this was the fact that Lisa was 18 years old and too little time had passed since she disappeared. The guy waited a few more hours, and then started calling mutual friends. None of them knew where she was missing. He also called Lisa's boss and then tried to contact her parents, but they were not at home. They came back hours later and their phone was ringing off the hook. Several people tried to contact them at once to see if they had heard from their daughter. At first, the parents thought Lisa had just been delayed and was still on the road. She had traveled this route many times before, and it was hard to imagine that anything could have happened to her, but time passed and she was still gone. By then her parents had called Ed and called him over to their house. The first meeting that Lisa had planned for so long happened without her and under such unsettling circumstances. 2 days passed. The young woman was still unreachable and the police refused to start looking for her. According to the law, it was necessary to wait 72 hours before filing a missing person report. The parents decided not to sit idly by and start searching on their own. Lisa's father hired a light aircraft pilot to fly along the road where the young woman was supposed to be. He hoped this would help locate her car, but the search was unsuccessful. The father also drove part of that route in his car, but he was unable to find any sign of Lisa. The family did not stop there. The young woman's parents contacted a private investigator they knew who had previously worked for the police. Thanks to his connections, he was able to convince the local police department to take an early missing person report. Unfortunately, they could not find any solid leads. The police immediately determined that their patrol officer had stopped Lisa the night she disappeared, but her fate remained unknown. Only one thing was clear. The young woman had disappeared with the car somewhere between Douglas and the town of Cody. The police had searched the area along that route, but there was one significant problem. We are talking about hundreds of miles of fields, woods, and mountains. It took months of work and thousands of people to cover the entire area. For this reason, the search on the ground made little or no progress. 8 days passed. On the morning of April 2nd, a man called the police. He said he was fishing in a river near Casper, Wyoming. At one point, he noticed a human body lying face down in the water. Shortly before, the fisherman had heard on the radio the police were looking for a missing young woman. So he immediately thought it was her. Detectives arrived on the scene, took the body out of the water, and determined that the deceased was indeed Lisa. Medical experts have studied the body and came to a terrible discovery. They determined that the young woman died about 6 days after her disappearance. That is, Lisa died just 2 days before the discovery, and detectives had to figure out where she was all this time. That said, police initially thought the death occurred about 5 hours after she disappeared, which later led to confusion. Had been abused while alive. And on her body, they found several stab wounds and contusions. Apparently, she had been thrown into the water from a bridge while she was unconscious. Police later confirmed this version, finding blood on the bridge. Finally, medical experts extracted biological material from the young woman's body, which turned out to be a sample of male semen and apparently belonged to the killer. It was sent to a lab. But in those years, the tools to study DNA were very scarce. The local lab simply did not have the necessary resources to extract the profile of the perpetrator. Detectives concluded that the killer was most likely a local resident who lived near the river. This was evidenced by the fact that the bridge from which the young woman had been thrown was located in a remote wilderness area. It had not been used for a long time, and in order to access it, one had to turn from the main road to a country road and then drive some distance. Based on that, the police assumed that only someone who knew the area well could have chosen this bridge for a body dump. Detectives focused on finding Lisa's car. They assumed that the killer had driven it somewhere and there might be additional clues in it. But the car seemed to have fallen under the ground and they could not find it. Investigators actively shared information about the case with the public, hoping that someone had useful information. The case was also widely televised, and a lot of people did come forward. But here something strange started to happen. In all, the police received more than 100 calls. People said they had seen a Honda CRX with little misplates, as well as Lisa herself. Only these testimonies came from different states, and even Canada. A few appeals seemed more convincing to the police. 5 different witnesses claimed to have seen the very car with the license plate, Little Miss, driven by a young woman who closely resembled Lisa. Except this was a few days after her disappearance on March 26th and 27th. It's hard to imagine that the young woman stayed in the Casper area for several days for whatever reason, and didn't see fit to call her relatives. Moreover, she had to go to work on Monday and she would never have missed it. One witness stated that there was a man sitting in the car with Lisa, but the police were unable to confirm this information. Based on all the inquiries, the detectives compiled 7 portraits of the alleged men seen near Lisa, but none of them were of any help to the investigation. The descriptions were too different to isolate any one man. The police questioned the words of all these witnesses. They conceded that the killer might have driven Lisa's car, but there was no logical explanation that she herself could have driven around the area all weekend without calling her parents from any nearby payphone. Apparently, one of the witnesses actually saw the killer drive Lisa's car to hide it. Is either erroneous or outright false. Police later determined that there were several similar car models registered in that area, and witnesses may well have seen them. During the investigation, detectives identified several suspects, but they all turned out not to have been involved in the case. 6 months later, police had a new tip. Someone pinned an envelope to Lisa's grave with a note. In it, on behalf of a man, it was written that he missed Lisa and called her death his painful loss. The letter was signed by Stringfellow Hawk, a character from a popular television series at the time. At first glance, there didn't seem to be anything suspicious about the note, but all of Lisa's relatives and acquaintances denied having anything to do with the letter. The detectives therefore assumed that it might have been left by the killer. Exactly 1 year after Lisa's disappearance, the case was reported on a popular television program devoted to unsolved crimes. Given that it was watched by millions of viewers across the country, the police received numerous tip-off calls. It took months and extra manpower for local detectives to verify them. Lisa's parents felt that the local police department could not handle the volume of tips and leads that came in after the program ended. For this reason, they wanted the FBI to handle their daughter's murder. But Sheriff Ron Ketchum was very negative about the idea and said he had no intention of giving the case up. In spite of that, A year later, Lisa's parents still got federal investigators involved in the case with the support of higher authorities. They became involved in the investigation and wanted to work with the sheriff, but he would not cooperate or even return their calls. Thanks to the FBI's involvement, the detectives were now able to examine a DNA sample from the victim's body at a federal lab. It was compared to Lisa's boyfriend's sample, and they did not match. He had not been considered a suspect before, but the investigators decided to be 100% sure. Next, they decided to check the patrolman who had stopped Lisa shortly before she disappeared. He had a recording of a conversation with the young woman that showed him saying goodbye to her. But detectives conceded that he might have found Lisa and attacked her later. The officer immediately agreed to provide his DNA sample, and it did not match the killer's. The next unexpected tip came after a local radio station aired a program about Lisa's murder. The police were contacted by a witness who stated that he had seen the young woman stopped in the road by Sheriff Ron Ketchum on the day she disappeared, and there were some really suspicious moments here. The sheriff himself never said he stopped Lisa that night. He also actively opposed the FBI's involvement in the case, and just like that, exactly 2 years after Lisa's murder, a man quit the force and tried to take his own life. He was able to be recuperated and was undergoing psychological treatment at the time. Investigators came to him with questions, but Ron pleaded not guilty and refused to provide a DNA sample. This all looked suspicious, and the investigators began to seriously consider him as a suspect. But a few months later, when they were ready to apply for a court order for a DNA sample, the man did provide one himself, and it did not match the killer's sample. It's not entirely clear why the sheriff was acting so strangely if he had nothing to do with Lisa's murder. His colleagues pointed out that he had always been a complicated and closed person who had been through Vietnam, so he was behaving this way even before the young woman's disappearance. At this point, the police ran out of serious leads. In 1992, they published more data on the case in the hope that they would be able to find new witnesses. According to the main version of the investigation, there could have been several perpetrators. Most likely one man kidnapped and killed Lisa, but someone helped him get rid of the car. Investigators also believe that the young woman was kidnapped during a traffic stop, at a gas station or somewhere else. They ruled out the option of Lisa picking up a hitchhiker because the young woman was very cautious. Shortly before these events, Lisa's car stalled on the road and another driver stopped to help her. The young woman did not get out of the car and only lowered her window slightly to talk to him because she understood the potential risk. The police never managed to get any new leads and the case went cold for another 10 years. It wasn't until July 2002 that a long-awaited breakthrough awaited them. The local police department reopened the investigation, and the first thing they did was put the killer's DNA sample into the FBI database. It didn't yet exist in the late 80s, and it took many years for it to start being used en masse across the country. When they did add a sample from Lisa's body there, investigators immediately got a match. The sample belonged to a 59-year-old man named Dale Wayne Eaton, who was in prison at the time. He had been arrested in 1997 for armed assault on a family. A young couple and their child were driving through the Wyoming wilderness when their car stalled. Dale drove by and stopped to help. He inspected the car and said there was no way to fix it on the spot. So we offered the family a ride to the nearest service station, which supposedly belonged to his brother. They agreed and got into his van, and a few miles later, Dale said he was tired and needed to sleep. He asked the woman to drive, and he got into the back of the van himself. When the car moved, he pulled out his rifle and ordered the woman to pull off onto a country road. But the woman twisted the wheel so hard that Dale lost his balance and dropped his weapon. They got out of the car, and the perpetrator pulled out a knife. But at that moment, the father of the family grabbed the rifle and hit Dale with the buttstock. The family then got into his van and drove to the nearest police station. Detectives drove to the scene, located Dale nearby, and arrested him. During his trial, he was found to have a number of mental disabilities. So instead of going to jail, they sent him to a closed rehabilitation facility. The idea of the authorities was that he would spend several years there, during which time he would be held to get on with his life, learn a profession, and so on. However, he escaped from there after a few months, for which he was arrested and sent to prison for 5 years. The important thing here is that before he was incarcerated, a DNA sample was taken from Dale and entered into the FBI database. Finally got a match. He was 43 years old at the time of Lisa's murder and lived near that area. Upon examining Dale's background, law enforcement discovered an impressive list of offenses behind him. He committed his first serious crime at the age of 16. Dale sold a woman some watermelon and offered to help carry them home. When they entered the premises, the woman examined the watermelons and saw that they were rotten. She refused to pay for them, and after a brief argument, Dale stabbed her and then fled. The guy was arrested the next day and the court sent him to compulsory treatment. He was diagnosed with a number of moderate mental disorders. After receiving treatment, he kept changing jobs because he couldn't get a foothold in any job. Sometime later, he married and the couple had 3 children. The marriage was not happy. The couple quarreled constantly and divorced after 15 years. In 1996, he moved to a town called Moneta, just an hour away from Casper. There, his in-laws had several unfinished buildings and a bus converted to housing on the property. It was there that Dale settled in. There were no living conditions in that bus, except for a small bed. Once in a while, he would go to a neighbor's house to take a shower. As a result, there was an inveterate repeat offender before the investigation, whose DNA was found on Lisa's body. But they wanted more evidence before they could charge him. Officers arrived at the precinct where he lived before his arrest. Several neighbors lived a short distance away and one of them told the detectives an interesting story. According to him, around the same time Lisa disappeared, Dale dug a huge hole on his property. He said he was going to put in a septic tank, but that never happened. Lisa's car with Little Miss plates was there. With all this in hand, the police set about gathering all the data they needed to build a win-win case against Dale since they had more than enough time. While in prison, the man had killed his cellmate. So it would be a while before he got out. In April 2003, he was finally charged with the murder of Lisa Kimmel. The man refused to plead guilty, so the case went to trial. Because of the usual bureaucracy of the American judicial system, the trial did not begin until a year later. The prosecution summoned Dale's other cellmate to testify. According to him, the man confessed to him about Lisa's murder and told him all the details. The young woman allegedly saw him on the side of the road, stopped and agreed to give him a ride. At one point, Dale began to molest her, but was rebuffed. Then he pulled out a gun and ordered her to his house, where he held her for several days and then killed her. But no one believed this version. Lisa's parents said she would never stop at night in the middle of nowhere to take a hitchhiker. Either Dale lied to his cellmate or he made up the story himself to reduce his sentence for testifying. So he clearly had a motive to lie. According to the investigation, that's not what happened. Most likely Lisa stopped at a gas station and that's where Dale attacked her. They even named a specific gas station between Casper and Dale's house. Lisa had to drive past it on her way to Cody. Dale himself often drove there to use the public restroom and sink since he had no water on the property. Most likely he got into her car and used a gun to force her to drive to some remote location, then brought her back to his station and helped her in the bus. A few days later he decided to get rid of her, stabbed her several times and dumped her in the water. Experts also compared the handwriting of the note left on Lisa's grave with Dale's. They found a high similarity, but it was hard to call it evidence in court. Regardless, the DNA evidence on the body and the car on Dale's property was enough to convict him. Even the attorneys understood this, and they tried to avoid the death penalty for their client rather than a complete acquittal. They pointed to the mental abnormalities that made him unable to take full responsibility for his actions, but all was in vain. The jury found Dale guilty, and as a result, he was sentenced to death. Lisa's parents then filed a civil suit against him, which was granted by the court. Dale was seized from the land, with the buildings on it, and gave it all into the possession of the young woman's parents. Those, along with the fire department, burned all these structures to the ground. On Lisa's birthday. Since the conviction, Dale's attorneys have filed numerous appeals to overturn the death penalty, which have always been rejected. But in 2010, the court did accept the appeal and set a new hearing. The appeal was accepted on the grounds that in imposing the sentence, the court failed to consider the offender's severe childhood, mental disabilities, and developmental delays. In addition, lawyers latched onto Dale's cellmate's testimony. The jury was not warned that the man had been promised a reduced sentence for this, so his testimony may well have been made up. Despite all this, there is no question of a complete reversal of the sentence. Dale is still in prison and is currently 78 years old, so the death penalty is unlikely to take place. There is one more point worth mentioning in this whole story. There have been several murders and strange disappearances of young women in the area where Dale lived, which have not yet been solved. The police have no evidence on hand, but they admit that Dale could have been the killer. His entire biography indicates that he is clearly prone to serial crimes, so Lisa Kimmel might not have been his only victim. Share your opinion on this story in the comments. A woman mysteriously disappeared from her own home and her friends decided to go to the police. At first, it looked as if she herself had gone somewhere, but with each new clue, the case became more and more creepy. Eventually, investigators were able to uncover the mystery and the truth turned out to be quite frightening. Mindy Schloss was born in 1955 in New York City. When she was 25, she moved to Alaska, where she graduated from a local medical university. The woman earned a degree in psychiatry and took a job as a nurse at Fairbanks Hospital, though most of the time she had to work on the field. Many people in remote areas of Alaska were not able to go to the hospital on their own, so Mindy and her colleagues would use all manner of transportation, including boats and airplanes, to get to them. She loved her job and took it as seriously as she could. Mindy lived about 600 kilometers from the hospital in Anchorage. She took a plane to work and stayed in a hotel all weekdays, going home on weekends. It was August 2007. Mindy, who was 52 years old at the time, returned to Anchorage for the weekend and was soon to fly back to work. During her absence, she always asked her best friend, Jerry, to stop by her house to feed her cat and give him the medicine he needed. On Saturday, August 4th, her friend called her to discuss the matter, but Mindy never came to the phone. She still hadn't been able to reach her all day, and it was strange. So Jerry contacted their mutual friend, but he, too, had not called Mindy that day. At first, Jerry thought Mindy had gone somewhere on business, but she didn't answer her phone the next day either. Then her friend decided to drive to her house. No one answered the door knock either, and Jerry used her spare key. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The house was in order, there were no signs of a struggle or any other evidence that something bad had happened to Mindy. It was only on the way out that Jerry noticed something strange. The doorknob of the front door was loose, and the woman decided to tighten the screws with a screwdriver. After that, she went to work without knowing where her friend had disappeared to. On Monday, August 6th, Jerry called the hospital where Mindy worked. To her surprise, the woman never showed up for work, which was completely out of character for her. Nor did she contact any of her coworkers to alert them of her absence. All this indicated that something might have happened to the woman, and Jerry decided to contact the police. The police department took a missing persons report and Jerry and the detective went to Mindy's house again. No sign of a break-in was found. There was also nothing of value missing from the house. This ruled out the possibility that a burglar had broken into the woman's home. What's more, Mindy had some medications in her home that were only available with a doctor's prescription. Any burglar would most likely have taken them since they were in demand among people with drug addictions. Upon entering the garage, they discovered that Mindy's car was missing. It was also very strange. The woman always took a cab to the airport and only used her car to get around town. The police concluded that something really bad had happened to the woman. A forensic team examined the house, trying to find any clues, but it was inconclusive. At the time, the kidnapping theory was unlikely. The police thought Mindy might have probably had an accident. She often went to the countryside and the terrain in those parts was quite dangerous. People could have fallen prey to wild animals or just accidentally fallen off a cliff. But this theory did not bring the police any closer to solving the case, and they decided to begin a search for suspects who, in theory, could have been involved in her disappearance. The first thing they did was check on Bob, Mindy, and Jerry's mutual friend. The men were eager to cooperate with the investigation, and the detectives quickly determined that on the day of the woman's disappearance, he was at work, many miles away from her home. The police had no clear answer. The woman had not been in touch since Saturday. After examining her computer, experts determined that the last time she used it was at 1:30 a.m. that same day. With no solid leads, police decided to enlist the help of the public. They posted flyers around town with information about the missing woman and distributed the information to local TV stations. The same day, they began receiving calls from witnesses, but most of the leads led nowhere. People reported seeing Mindy in various places and even in other states. None of these leads were ever helpful. Meanwhile, Bob and his coworkers decided to comb the area where Mindy might have gone. She had been out in the countryside quite often for berries or just out for a walk. Unfortunately, the search also yielded no results. The detectives decided to go a different route and contacted the bank the woman used. They asked them to check to see if there had been any activity on her cards in recent days, and this is where a serious lead finally awaited them. Early Sunday morning, the day after Mindy went missing, someone had withdrawn $500 from her debit card, the maximum amount available for withdrawing in a 24-hour period. Police immediately obtained the ATM camera footage from the bank, and they got a disturbing sighting. It turned out that the money had been withdrawn by an unknown man. His face was covered by a bandana, so they could not identify him. He pulled down the bandana only after his face was out of the camera's field of view. As a result, the police had no choice but to wait until the man tried to use someone else's card again. Meanwhile, the detectives received another tip. They learned from Mindy's coworkers that the woman was planning to renovate her home and had hired workers. At some point, she had a conflict with their supervisor over the cost of the work. Mindy later admitted to her coworkers that she was afraid of him because he acted strangely during visits to her home. The police checked on the man, but he turned out to have an alibi for the day. The woman they also questioned another worker who came to her house on Friday around 7 p.m. The man was also uninvolved and he couldn't remember anything suspicious that night. It wasn't long before detectives had a new lead. Bank security reported that Mindy's card had been charged $500 again in the early morning hours, but this time from a different ATM. After studying the security footage, the police immediately realized it was the same man as the first time. But there was something odd on the tape. The man withdrew the money and left, but returned to the ATM a few seconds later. He walked around it for a while, pushing buttons, and eventually left again. After calling the bank, detectives found out the reason for his strange behavior. The unknown person forgot to take the card out and the ATM then takes it away to prevent the theft. The real owner can get it back by going to the bank with his ID. Of course, this was not an option for the criminal, so he lost access to Minnie's account forever. This time, the police managed to find a witness. He drove up to the very same ATM when an unidentified man came out of there. According to the witness, he got on his bicycle and rode away. It was a significant lead since most people were traveling by car or on foot, but all that information was still not enough to get any closer to a clue. And detectives decided to interview everyone in the Mindy area. They asked people to recall any oddity or to point them to neighbors who were suspicious. To their surprise, many residents named one particular house, right near Mindy's house. According to them, parties were constantly held there. The residents were always making noise and disturbing the peace. The detectives went there and found out that quite a number of people were living there, but they weren't willing to talk to the police. The detectives then went to a woman who lived directly across the street from the house. She said she did not see anything suspicious, but her demeanor showed that she was very nervous. The next day, the woman called the police station and asked the detectives to meet, but not at her house. They met at another location and the woman shared a creepy story. Shortly before the detectives' first visit, a man who lived across the street had stopped by to see her. He said police were walking around the neighborhood and asked the woman not to tell them he lived here. When asked why, he said he was on parole and did not want the police to know his location. At night, the woman heard someone walking on the porch of her house. She looked out the window and saw that it was the same man. He stomped around, looked in several windows and left. The woman was greatly frightened and decided to tell the police about it. Detectives learned his name was Josh Wayne, who was 27 years old at the time. After running him through the database, they found out that the guy had been convicted of murder 7 years earlier. At the time, he was accused of beating a woman to death, but a jury acquitted him. As a result, Josh was accused of tampering with evidence and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. After spending 3 years behind bars, he was released early. Detectives immediately identified him as a prime suspect. After talking to his housemates, they found out that Josh didn't have a car and that he got around mainly by bicycle. But there was just one problem. When police began looking for him, the man had disappeared without a trace. On Thursday, August 9th, police suddenly had another lead. A local trucker called them and said he had spotted Mindy's car in a parking lot near the airport. He had seen its picture in the newspapers and immediately recognized the car. Detectives arrived on the scene and confirmed that the car was indeed Mindy's. They also noticed that a surveillance camera was pointed at the parking lot from a nearby building and requested a recording. It showed a man driving this car into the parking lot at 12:30 p.m. on August 4th, getting out and wiping down the door handle. Apparently, he was wiping off his fingerprints. Unfortunately, the quality of the recording did not allow his face to be seen. CSI examined the car for prints or traces of DNA and were able to recover some samples. However, it took time to study them and there was no guarantee they would be useful in the case. On the passenger seat was Mindy's purse, which could indicate that the woman had been in the car with the perpetrator, alive or dead. Not getting the results they wanted from using modern analysis tools, the detectives decided to use search dogs. Few believed this idea would succeed since it had been a week since Mindy had disappeared. But for lack of other options, they still took the search. Turn to film dogs. The service dog was taken to the ATMs from which the unknown man had withdrawn money, as well as Mindy's car. The dog picked up the trail and headed down the street toward the woman's house, located 3 blocks from that location. After sniffing the front door, she went straight to the very house where Josh Wayne had previously lived. The detectives, who until recently had not believed in the search dog idea, were shocked. The service dog directly pointed them to the fact that Josh was in Mindy's car, near her house and near those ATMs. The next day, the police repeated the experiment with another search dog. The result was the same. The dogs walked the entire distance and stopped at Josh's house. Though it was not an unqualified piece of evidence that would work in court, the detectives decided not to waste their time and obtained a warrant for the suspect's arrest. They went to his house, but the man hadn't been there in days. After searching the building, they found the same jacket that the unidentified man had been wearing on the cameras near the ATMs, and in the pocket was a cash withdrawal slip from Mindy's card. Next, they discovered a woman's gold watch and immediately showed it to Jerry. The woman confirmed that the watch belonged to Mindy. The experts were able to compare the DNA samples found on the steering wheel of Mindy's car with samples from items from his home, and they matched. This indicated that Josh had been in the missing woman's car. This evidence was already much more serious, and the police were focused on catching the suspect. Leaflets with his name were posted all over the city, and they even rented several billboards. According to detectives, it was one of the largest manhunt operations in Alaskan history. Virtually every law enforcement officer was working on the matter, and locals reported any suspicious evidence. At one point, police released ATM camera photos and were approached almost immediately by a woman named Lisa. She said she had met Josh before and was sure he was the one in the photo. The important thing here is that the police did not name the main suspect, but what followed was the turning point in the case. Another acquaintance of Josh's came to the police with a confession. For the past week, she had been helping him get around town by transporting him in her car. One day he left his backpack in the back seat, and the young woman and her mother looked inside. There they found several more ATM receipts, as well as a phone. In the gallery, they found a photo in which Josh was supposedly holding a gun in his hand. For the police, this information only added to the alarm. Detectives already feared that the suspect might attack someone else while they were looking for him. And thanks to his phone, they found out that he was also armed. The cops tried to convince his girlfriend to help them catch Josh. They wanted the young woman to take a tape recorder with her and go to meet him, where they would try to get him to talk about what he had done to Mindy. But the young woman was too scared and refused. Soon, however, she had to participate against her own will. On September 2nd, Josh came to her house and, in an aggressive manner, began demanding her backpack. Given that the young woman gave it to the police, she had to come up with an excuse on the fly. Realizing she didn't have the backpack, Josh asked her to take him somewhere, far away from here to hide from the police. But the young woman refused. Instead, she offered to let him stay at her house. But Josh suspected something was wrong and left. The young woman realized that she would not be safe until the police caught the man. So she decided to follow him discreetly in her car, calling the detectives along the way. At some point, Josh reached his acquaintance's house and went inside. By that time, the police, SWAT, and FBI had already begun to converge on the scene. Everyone feared that the suspect would not surrender without a fight, and those fears proved to be true. Using weapons, Josh took 2 people who were in the house with him hostage. A lawyer was invited to negotiate with him, who after several hours, managed to convince him to surrender. During the interrogation, he hardly spoke to the police, but the investigators were in no hurry to accuse him of killing Mindy. At that point, they already thought the woman was probably dead, but without her body, it would have been extremely difficult to prove it. So Josh was only charged with stealing Mindy's bank card and watch. The FBI agent decided to get crafty. He listed the charges to Josh and he said they were all lies. The investigator then stated that they had evidence that he was the one who withdrew the money from someone else's card, and Mindy herself had gone to the police to report the card theft. Upon hearing this, the suspect grinned and asked what games they were trying to play with him. The FBI agent was finally convinced that Josh had killed Mindy, but the police still had to find her body in order to charge Josh with murder. They had to work against the weather. It was snowing early in that area, and they would have no chance of finding Mindy if her remains got snowed in. On September 13th, police received a call from an electrician working near the town of Wasilla, about 100 miles from Anchorage. He spotted the body of a woman in a wooded area and immediately thought it was Mindy, and experts from the lab confirmed it. The deceased was indeed Mindy Schloss. The medical examination revealed that the woman had been shot in the back of the head and her remains had been disposed of by fire. After the bullet was recovered, it was determined that it had been fired from the very weapon with which Josh had been apprehended. All the police had to do now was to figure out how the events that led to Minnie's death unfolded. Meanwhile, the experts continued to examine every millimeter of her house, trying to find any trace of Josh's presence. It was extremely difficult to do so. They had to collect virtually every hair from the floor of Minnie's house and then examine it in the lab. It took months, but eventually they were able to find a hair that belonged to Josh. This was confirmed by DNA testing, and the detectives now had proof in hand of the suspect's presence in the victim's home. On May 18, 2008, 10 months after the murder, he was finally charged and brought to trial. While gathering witnesses to testify against Josh, an interesting situation occurred. His ex-girlfriend, Lisa, who had identified him from a photo near an ATM, refused to testify in court. She regularly visited her ex-boyfriend in prison, and at one point, the couple announced their intention to marry. Investigators were shocked by this turn of events, but they quickly realized what was behind the move. The U.S. Constitution allows relatives not to testify against each other, and in all likelihood, Josh convinced Lisa to marry him for these reasons. There was one problem though. Soon after the marriage was consummated, it was declared null and void because state law prohibited weddings with inmates, but the detectives wondered why Josh was so intent on shielding Lisa from questioning and testifying. Was it really all about some pictures outside an ATM where you couldn't even see his face? Most likely, the young woman knew a lot more. Investigators tried to get her to talk, but at first they did not succeed. At some point, Lisa herself contacted them and said that Josh confessed to her about the murder during one of her visits to the prison. According to his story, there was a party at his house Friday night. Josh, who had no means of livelihood, decided to sneak into the house next door and steal something. That house turned out to be Mindy's place. At one point, Mindy walked into the room, and he immediately realized that if he let her live now, he wouldn't be able to avoid jail. He didn't want to go there again, so he grabbed the woman, took her to the bathroom, and tied her hands. The perpetrator then went to his house to get a gun, taking some handy things to kidnap her with. Before returning to Mindy's house, he put bags of her legs and secured them with duct tape, so as not to leave any trace. He then took the woman to the garage, put her in his own car, and drove out of town. After an hour of driving, he stopped in a wooded area and drove Mindy away from the road, where he killed her. Josh then returned to her house, cleaned, vacuumed the carpet, and left. The trial did not begin until the spring of 2009. The prosecution had offered Josh a deal. He would confess to killing Mindy and another woman 7 years earlier in exchange for waiving the death penalty. This way, the authorities hoped to close 2 high-profile cases at once, and Josh agreed. As a result, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison without parole. During the reading of the sentence, Josh cried, But at one point things heated up when the judge called him a coward for taking the lives of 2 women. The criminal jumped up and shouted, "What about the men I killed?" At this point, his lawyers grabbed him and silenced him before he could say anything else. That shouting kept the detectives busy for 5 long years until in 2014, Josh himself offered authorities a new deal. He agreed to confess to the murders of 3 men if he was transferred from a local prison to a federal prison. Apparently the conditions there were much higher. Considering that the criminal's request was insignificant, the authorities agreed. Josh said he killed 1 man in Anchorage in 1994 when he was only 14 years old. He committed the next murder in 1999 and he killed the 3rd man a year later, the same day he massacred the woman. The first 2 men have been identified, but the identity of the 3rd is still a mystery. Investigators have no doubt that Josh was indeed involved in the murders. They are more concerned about another question, whether there are no other crimes under his belt, about which he is silent. In any case, the police have managed to permanently isolate him from society and prevent other murders that would surely have followed. Share your opinion on the story in the comments and don't forget to like it if you liked the video. Thanks for watching.